Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at the modern horror RPG Feed by Chris Newton. It's a book of about 140 pages, and I'm reviewing a colour PDF version which is available on a pay what you want basis from Drive-Thru RPG, and I'll put a link down below in the comments section so you can obtain a copy yourself if you'd like. This game was mentioned as a possible alternative to some of the more mainstream vampire/horror RPGs by a fellow member of the YouTube Brigade, and it uses a dice pool mechanic with traits being assigned different types of dice representing the importance, with D3s being weaknesses, D4s being as harmful as they are helpful, D6 traits being assets, and traits that are rated with a D10 being amongst your character's greatest strengths. Each trait is also allocated a number of dice to roll, with the least important traits having 1, most of the others having 2, and the traits that are really central and core to the concept of your character having 3. When a dice roll is called for, every dice in your pool that comes up with a 3 or higher is a success. Every one that comes up as a 2 or lower is a fail. The idea of Feed is that you sketch out your story in advance, and that the rules of vampirism and the supernatural are created as part of the narrative to meet the individual needs of the story. Now, the first step in this process is creating a story profile, which is essentially laying out some guidelines for the story that you intend to tell. And there are a number of suggestions given for this. The first is a collaborative method where the whole group writes a profile between them. Now, I'm a big fan of handing a lot of narrative control over to the players and sharing this whole responsibility between the players and the GM and bringing the whole group into it. So I was quite gratified to see that there. Whilst the other concept is a more traditional method where the GM writes out the story profile, possibly with some input from the players, and hands it to them as a campaign outline. This chapter lays out a series of questions such as who are the protagonists, where does the story take place, etc., that can be used to help define the story. And these are welcome additions, since often I find that it can be very overwhelming if you just handed a blank canvas and told to run with it. It's always good to have a few pointers, a few suggestions to get the ball rolling. And there are some interesting examples given. The game offers 2 commandments when it comes to vampires as represented by the game. One is that vampires have to feed in some manner, and that vampiric nature must oppose some other non-vampiric part of the character's nature. And I think it's nice that this is clearly laid out from the start. The next part of the game deals with creating a vampire strain or type of vampire, and this is done by making choices in several distinct categories, which are aging, how the vampires get older, assuming they do; appearance, can the vampires of this strain blend in with humanity, or are they noticeably different; can your particular strain of vampirism be cured; and feeding, what method do vampires use to feed; physiology, the biological function of the vampire; transmission, how vampirism is spread; gifts, which are the powers and extra abilities that the undead possess; and weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of a particular vampiric strain. We then move on to character generation, which is interesting and features a set of 16 questions, the answers to which help determine the human traits of the character, with the vampire traits being determined a little later on in the process. These include questions like which relationship represents your most important personal responsibility, and what ritual or habit do you use to keep yourself grounded, amongst others. Now, I'm a big fan of character questionnaires, and I like the idea of using these questions to actually determine the traits of the character. And again, it all comes back to this point of giving you a good jumping off or starting point, rather than just presenting you with a blank canvas and saying, go for it. The next heading is character degeneration, and this section details how to transform your human character into a vampire using the details determined earlier when the strain was created. This is done by selectively replacing your human traits, as determined earlier, with vampiric traits. The maximum number of vampiric traits a character may start with is 7, and the number of vampiric traits represents how far divorced from their humanity the character has become. The dice size of vampiric traits rises to D12, although the number of dice in the pool remains the same, so clearly showing that despite the morality loss, there is a trade-off with physical or social or mental power when someone becomes a vampire, and this is very in keeping with the mythology, I think. The rules are quite interesting, and we discussed them a little bit earlier in this review, although the game does go into an awful lot of detail regarding various modifiers, equipment having their own dice pools, and such things like that. There are some nice rules on creating quick NPCs that I'm sure will be very useful, and a nice template system that is made available that could be used to create NPCs with minimal fuss, which is always handy in an RPG, especially if as a GM you find yourself pushed for time. The next section is called The Addiction and deals with the fact that during their unlife vampires accrue hunger dice, represented by D12s, which can be rolled against them, and associated hunger traits that can be used to compel or tempt them. Anytime a player rolls a 1 or 2 during a stressful situation, they gain a hunger dice, or indeed activating some of their vampiric powers can also accrue these hunger dice. And hunger is eliminated by feeding or by using a human trait and what it represents as an anchor to suppress the bestial part of their vampiric nature, effectively represented by rolling a human trait and reducing the hunger dice by the number of successes after an appropriate scene has been played out. The section called The Session and the Story offers some very useful GMing advice for running both one-shots and longer campaigns, and there is a nice section called Resources that follows, which offers a brief guide to vampiric fiction and some guidelines and hints and tips related to certain types of horror stories and how to run them and portray that sort of atmosphere. A number of sample strains are offered along with a useful glossary of terminology, and the book rounds out with some quick reference sheets and some simple but functional character sheets. In conclusion, I thought that Feed was a very impressive attempt at producing a different feeling vampire game, and I love the emphasis on creating the rules of vampirism based on the needs of a particular story. However, I do feel that the rules were a little inelegant, considering that the narrative focus of the game was supposed to be on the conflict between the human and the vampiric side of a character's nature. I think perhaps a less rules heavy solution could have been reached, but that may just be down to my personal preference. And some of the text was a little dense and confusing, particularly when it got into the nitty gritty and the detailed explanations of the rules. The artwork in the book is very good and very atmospheric, and it's all clearly laid out. In conclusion, I think that the rules have a lot of potential, but they're a little too crunchy and a little bit convoluted for my liking. However, there are definitely some ideas involved in the game, and for the low price of paying what you want, you can't really complain. If you're looking for a different take on vampire RPGs from the big boys of the RPG scene, some interesting GM advice and rules that are begging for some house rulings and some customization, then you really cannot go far wrong with getting hold of a PDF copy of this book. And I'd highly recommend you at least give it a look, especially for the low price that it's on offer at. Well, that's all for this video. I hope that you'll consider clicking on like and that you'll subscribe to this channel. We release new videos every Wednesday. If you have any comments on this system or vampire RPGs in general, please put them in the comments box below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. So until next time, I look forward to reading what you write. Thanks very much for watching and for listening.